What's up? My name is Gribbly. You are witnessing my ongoing folly, and today I'm going to do a field test of 3 really awesome black and white films. Ilford's HP5 Plus, you see that there, HP5 Plus, FP4 Plus, and Delta 100. These are very different films, but the deal is, I mean, there's tons of information out there on the internet about these films, but there's not a lot of information on how to shoot them in a zero image pinhole camera. So I'm going to be doing an actual field test. I'm going to tell you about why I'm doing this. I'm going to tell you about my methodology. I'm going to show you some of it, and then I'm going to show you the results. Stay tuned. So all 3 of these films are favorites among black and white photographers. Delta 100 is a super fine grain emulsion, but it's also kind of contrasty. So for what I'm doing with the pinhole camera, which we'll put in the shot and right there to look cool. I don't know if I want it to be that contrasty. It doesn't have the latitude that I might need for taking sort of haphazard exposures. So for that, I'm looking at also FP4 Plus, which again is a fine grain black and white film. It has a nominal speed of ISO 125 as opposed to the Delta 100, which is obviously 100. This is an old school film. It's not quite as slick and fancy as the Delta 100. So between these two, I think we're going to be looking for differences in latitude and differences in how the films perform with contrasty situation, and of course grain structure. And then finally, I mean, this test is kind of useless because I know I'm just going to end up shooting HP5 Plus anyway. This was my favorite film back in the day when I was shooting black and white. And it's a 400 speed film, which is probably more appropriate for pinhole. But I wanted to put it through its paces and see how it stacks up. Could there be a reason to convince me to go with one of the others over my old standby? Let's get started. So here's our methodology for this test. For each roll of film, Delta 100, FP4, and then HP5, we're going to run a series of 3 different scenes, 4 exposures of each scene. For the first exposure, we're going to take our metered value, and I've got I'm gonna note the metered value that my Sony A5100 is giving me with my lens at f/16. I'm going to note that value. I'm going to convert it using the handy dandy conversion wheel on the back of the zero image. Going to convert that to the zero image metered value, and then we're going to shoot at that value, and then plus 1 stop, plus 2 stops, plus 3 stops. And then after all this, I'm going to come back and I'm going to use the Ilford datasheet reciprocity curve to figure out what their recommended exposure would have been, to see, like, so we can look at these images and see which comes closest or where that would fall on the scale of images. Does that make sense? Anyway, we're looking for high contrast scenes, not unlike this one actually, my backyard here, but I think I might walk around just a little bit. Whatever we do, we're gonna have to do it 3 times. We're gonna have to run through 3 rolls all in the same light. So I'm gonna need to decide. It's a beautiful, sunny, broken cloud day out here. Can you see the clouds? There you go. And so we're gonna have to do it all when the sun is out, or all when the sun is behind a cloud. So I guess we'll just see what happens. Okay, I think we found our first scene. This is my neighbor's Airstream trailer. It's pretty awesome actually. And sorry, shutter speed's pretty slow there. As you can see, it's very reflective, and I think we're gonna get nothing but blue sky for this one. I think it's gonna be easier to test in open sun than it is gonna be to wait for these clouds. My Sony is telling me that at f/16, ISO 100, and 1/125th of a second, this scene looks well exposed. So when we come here and look at that on the dial on the back of the camera, f/16, we're going to be exposing this for ½ a second for starters. Okay, so we just did exposures at ½ a second, 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, all of this same shot. The sun changed a tiny bit during that, but I don't think it'll be relevant. Alright, this is our next scene. As you can see, it's a little dark with those same settings. So let's try... Ooh. Well, there's an 1/8 of a second. That looks about right, actually. Unfortunately, that's pretty slow, but That's the problem with 100 speed film. Let's go for... no, let's go for an eighth. Yep. That's what... No. We'll go... 15th. 8th. Damn. 15th. We're going to go for a 15th. 1, 1,000. 2, 1,000. 3, 1,000. 4, 1,000. Okay, now for the fun part. We're sticking the camera inside the window here, if you can see that. We're down at 1/4 of a second, so that's why everything's so blurry, but this ought to be interesting. Okay, so my Sony is heating up, and we've got a big storm coming in, so I didn't record any of the FP4 tests. Now I'm on the HP5, which is going to be difficult because these shutter speeds are going to be pretty short. This one meters at 1/250th of a second at f16, so that's going to be... we're going to start at 1/2 a second. No, we're going to start at 1/4 of a second. Even better. Boom! 3 exposed rolls of film. Not a moment too soon. Storm's coming. I think that the speeds on the HP5 were probably too short to be accurate in the beginning. But hey, that's a field test. Also, I double exposed one on the roll of FP4. But that's also a field test. That happens in the field. This is not a lab-controlled environment. We want to see how this film really behaves. You know, one thing I do want to say is that the Ilford films, the mechanics of these films, I find far superior to the Kodak stuff. Number one, you can't see this, but the frame indicator design, when you're advancing the film, you've got concentric circles that are much more useful than just the Kodak logo to help you know when the next frame is coming. And then the spools themselves have a plus sign slotted into them as opposed to the minus sign. This original spool came from a Kodak roll. And that's so much easier. It's so much easier to slot the advanced lever in on the zero image. So I'm an Ilford fanboy. All right, let's get back to the house. Where's the focus? Where's the focus? Let's get back to the house and soup this film. Hey y'all, this is my favorite part of mixing Xtol. It's like magic. Isn't that cool? Just the tiniest bit of powder. All right, I gotta stir. So it's worth noting, before I forget, these images were developed in Xtol diluted 1:1 with distilled water, and I followed the developing times on the massive dev chart. Except when I developed the FP4 and Delta 100, the times were only off by 30 seconds out of 10 minutes of development. So I cheated and I developed both for 10 minutes and 15 seconds as opposed to 10 minutes and then 10 minutes and 30 seconds. So I could develop them in the same tank, get through the test faster. I don't think that's going to make any difference. That's like 0.25%. Well, what is it? It's 2%. Extra development time for one and less for the other. I don't think that makes a difference, but I'm sure there are people out there that will say that I've ruined the entire test. I feel like I ruined the entire test when I did it in the field. Once again, this is not meant to be scientific. This is to test my actual workflow with films, and that is definitely something I would do in normal life. Is developed, like if films have a very close developing time, I would totally develop them in the same tank. Maybe that makes me imprecise. I think it just makes me pragmatic. Whatever you decide. All right, and now we have some finished negatives, and I have some thoughts just from looking at these, and my thoughts are rather surprising. Let's cut them, and I'll show you. Okay, so in classic Gribbly's Folly style, I do not own a light table. Therefore, these images are hanging on my wife's curtain on her side of the bedroom, where the curtain is all lacy and stuff. So here's the thing. Other than the blank space down here, where I apparently forgot to open the shutter, I can't tell the difference from a distance between these sets of negatives. The exposures are all very consistent one to another. So that tells me quite a bit about what I need to know just getting started. These films all work. Not only do they all work, even from this distance, I'm hard-pressed to tell them apart. I keep having to look at the film register to see which one I'm looking at, because they consistently go from well exposed to overexposed. Actually, I did do a double exposure there accidentally. This field test is getting more and more fieldy as time goes by. So anyway, I am very pleased. Just for what you're looking at now, this is the FP4, this is the HP5, and this is the Delta 100. And you know, I started this thinking I was going to go with the HP5 because of the speed. But man, these Delta 100 negatives look good. They pop in a way that I feel like the others don't quite. But you know, that's the danger of looking at negatives. Let's scan them and look at some images online. So we're looking here at the technical information for Ilford's film reciprocity failure compensation data sheet, and this gives you a factor for each of the films we're working with. This gives you a factor for the reciprocity correction. For those of you that don't know, when you shoot film for really long exposures, you got to factor in the reciprocity failure of the chemical emulsion, and this is a number they use to do that with each film, and you plug that number into this equation, and well, the one, yeah, okay, not all that. The equation at the very bottom right here that the mouse is hovering over, you plug that number in here, and it gives you Ilford's recommended exposure length in seconds for its reciprocity characteristics for each film. Now, way back in the day, Zeb Andrews, who's on Instagram as Lens Optional, he's a famous pinhole photographer. He gave me the advice to just use metered +2. So you meter an exposure and you add 2 stops to whatever metered value you get. And so I did do all the calculations with these numbers, but in each case, the Ilford recommended figure was within a stop or even a half a stop of the metered +2 Zeb Andrews rule. So for simplicity's sake, it's much easier just to remember metered +2 as opposed to, you know, all these numbers. I'm just going to use the Zeb Andrews rule from here on out. I think that's the easiest and best thing to do. And with black and white film, there's enough latitude that I'm not worried about a half a stop or even a stop of difference. Okay, welcome to the desktop of my Linux machine, which I normally use for recording Minecraft. We're going to be doing a little more serious work. I have taken these images. There were 36 images total. I don't want to show you guys 36 images on a YouTube video. That's a waste of time. So what I've done is I've taken the equivalent exposures, meaning the best exposures, which all ended up being metered +2, and I've processed them in 2 ways. I processed them with all the same settings across the board, and then I've processed them as if they were in my actual workflow. So the best folder is images processed to look as the best they can. And then these are processed to match. And so when we open up scene 1 here, we've got 3 identical photos. Well, not quite identical, but you'll see what I mean. We've got the Delta 100 version of this photo, the FP4 version, and the HP5. And these are all processed with the same black point, white point contrast. All that stuff is the same, so we can really look at the differences inherent in the film. So let's start with Delta 100. And for some reason, this shot is overexposed. Maybe Delta 100 has less of a tolerance. I don't know, but I don't like the exposure here as much as I do with the FP4 and the HP5. I'm just keeping it consistent frame to frame. This is the metered +2 exposure. So what you can see here, if you zoom all the way in, is you see the actual grain structure in the film. And that really matters for pinhole photography because you don't have a lot of detail to hide the grain structure. This is as sharp as the details get. And so you will see the grain. You know, normally in normal photography, you really only see grain in areas like the sky, but in pinhole photography, you see the grain all over the image. And I find the Delta 100 by far has the finest grain of any of these films. And that's actually a big selling point. Back in the day, I much preferred heavier grain, but these days, I don't know. The Delta 100 has some really gorgeous, tight, uniform grain. When you move over to the FP4, now this is a better exposure, so it's going to look better. But if we zoom in and look at the grain, I think we actually get sharper details here. Like look at the rivets as opposed to the rivets on the Delta 100 frame. We get sharper details, but I think that comes at the expense of slightly more pronounced grain. It's still fine. It's pretty smooth, but I do sense more like sort of a pepperiness in the really even areas of tone. And so that's, between the two, I probably wouldn't worry about it. These are both 100 speed films though, so there's not really an inherent, well, the FP4 is 125. There's not really much of an inherent advantage to the pronounced grain. Because it's not like we're ever going to get really super sharp photos. This is, like I said, as sharp as it's going to get. So between these two, just looking at the grain and the sharpness, I would go with the Delta 100. Let's look at the HP5. Now here we have a significant advantage in speed. It's 2 stops more speed than the Delta 100. But when we zoom in, man, that's a lot of grain. That's a lot of grain. And with nothing to hide it, I feel like it does detract from the image quality. I mean, this area here, and by the way, these are all TIFFs. There should not be any JPEG artifacting or anything like that. Here you can see a fiber that was on the negative. So that's what an actual sharp detail looks like, as opposed to the other stuff. And yeah, this grain. I mean, this to me looks more like a charcoal drawing than a like a sharp rendering in a black and white photograph. And so the question then becomes, is that worth the speed advantage? And sometimes yes, sometimes no. Let's keep looking here. All right, process to match. We'll look at the next scene just very quickly. And again, we'll zoom in on these areas in fine gradations of tone. I mean, here the grain itself is almost imperceptible. And then we move over to the FP4. Zoom all the way in, and yeah, there's a little bit of grain there, but nothing crazy. And I do think the FP4 is well. Let's go back and compare. So here's Delta 100 all the way zoomed in. Look at these details, and then we go over to the FP4. We zoom in. Again, I feel like the FP4 has the edge on sharpness, but sharpness isn't really what we're going for. So then we look at the HP5, and this shot is what kills it for me with the HP5. You can see an actual, I mean, depending on, you got to look hard, but you can see an actual distinction here between the tones, between this very strong highlight and this super ultra pretty much blown out highlight. There is a line where the grain just kind of appears out of nowhere, and that frankly is a deal killer for me, because I'm going to be using this film to take pictures of a lot of really smooth tones, and I do not want to see that gradation there. So this is the last scene, and this was the interior, and pretty much you'll see the same thing here. I'm not even going to zoom in. Delta 100, FP4 in different composition. When you don't have a viewfinder, that happens. And then the HP5. I actually like the look of the HP5 a lot better here in terms of the contrast. But again, zooming in all the way, I get that charcoal drawing feel. The grain is coarse, and a lot of these areas, I can see that line between the zones. So anyway, let's go back here and pull these out. These are the scenes, the same scenes processed as I would actual images that I was trying to present. So we're going to have a little more contrast, and again, I won't zoom in because the grain structure, we've pretty much covered that. Delta 100 beats the other two by a mile. And so, yeah, at this resolution, I can see a little more sharpness from the FP4, but it's not a big deal. And at this resolution, I can definitely see the tonal sort of degradation that the grain causes on the HP5. We'll leave the full screen. We'll go back here to the next scene. This is not the best setup for doing this. Thank you for your patience. And here, I mean, I actually love this image. I think this is really cool. Zooming all the way in, it's as sharp as it needs to be. And these are JPEGs, by the way, because that's how I will present the final images on the web. And we do get a little bit of JPEG artifacting. This is the Delta 100, super fine grain. The FP4, honestly, I probably couldn't tell the difference between these two. But I will show you some images, probably in another video, that sealed the deal for the Delta 100 for me. And then, again, the HP5. You're really just, I mean, this just looks splotchy to me. And that's sort of what kills it. That's sort of what kills it. And so the last frame, processed as best I could. Here's where the HP5, you can sort of see that, well, actually, here's where you can see the advantages of both the HP5 and the Delta. So this is the Delta. And compared to the FP4, I feel like the Delta has much more fidelity. It's got more pop to it. It doesn't feel like it's sort of coming apart, which I think is kind of a weakness of the older style emulsions. However, I will always love the contrast of HP5. There's just something about the tonal curve. But again, if we zoom in here, look at the details in this bucket. So this is HP5 and the grain around this bucket. We'll go back to the FP4, and the bucket is so much more smoothly rendered. If not sharper, it is smoother. And then the Delta 100, finally we'll be looking at that. And that I think is the best rendering of that part of this image from the Delta 100. So after going out and doing this test, I still felt inconclusive. It was hard for me to give up HP5 just for sentimental reasons, but also for the speed advantage. Then I went out in the field and I shot this image. And this image sealed the deal for the Delta 100. I think that HP5 and FP4 fail to achieve this kind of pop. It looks a little bit almost over-processed to me. I feel like it's right up on the line of high fidelity with a pinhole camera. So I had that qualm initially of like, well, maybe this looks too good. But then I thought, wait a minute, it's too good for what? It's not cheating. This isn't a contest. This image looks awesome, and the way in which you can zoom in here and see the smoothness of these tones and still maintain the local contrast, the sharpness, like from this highlight to this shadow. I don't think you can get that with any other film, or at least not any other film I've ever tested. And so this is the deal. This is the one for me. Can I zoom out here again? Yeah, this is the one for me for this project. I think I'm going to be using Delta 100 exclusively, and that does present some challenges because I'm getting exposures in terms of double-digit minutes, 10 minutes, 20-minute exposures. That makes things a little bit difficult, but I feel like for this level of precise contrast, I think it's worth it. So that's the test. I know it wasn't scientific. I know it's just a field test. It comes down to basically my preferences. But I appreciate you following along. I hope this has been useful for somebody out there if you're shooting pinhole work with black and white film. Thank you all for watching. Keep the ends out for the ties that bind.